when you guys are ready.
Cool.
Okay, so my name's Eric Glomski. I'm the owner of Page Spring Cellars, and actually these days, I was a winemaker for years. These days I call myself the wine grower because I've got a really competent winemaking team that's headed by Corey Turnbull, who also has Burning Tree Cellars. And for me, the next kind of frontier, and it's always been here, but for me, the next frontier is taking our wine to the next level. Is everything happens out here. So, and I love being outdoors, and as much as, with all due respect to the folks in the cellar, this is kind of where my heart is these days. Anyway, this is our Dos Padres vineyard. We're just about a half mile from our winery in Page Springs, and Dos Padres is named after my father and my stepfather who own the land. We lease it, and we're in our Barbera block. Of course, Barbera hails from the Piemonte region of northwestern Italy. And it's actually a grape that does amazingly well here, primarily, especially for our house style, because it holds on to acidity really well. pHs of these wines tend to be very low, TAs are high, so you can get them fairly ripe and still have a really nice acid structure without them getting flabby. And strangely, Syrah is kind of the king red grape in Arizona. Syrah has challenges with staying acidic as it gets riper. You really have to finesse it. And for me, at least, we generally try to get it physiologically ripe, but not super high in sugar, because we don't like high alcohol Syrahs, and that's way more difficult because as you're building sugar, you're of course losing acid. When Syrah gets to like 24 bricks-ish, all of a sudden it like crosses this threshold and your acid just drops out. And you have to be really careful not to go over that threshold. Barbera, it's a breeze. I wouldn't be surprised if Barbera became a more prominent grape in Arizona over time. So as far as talking about, some of the way that we grow these grapes and the trellis systems and the structures that we use to help kind of keep them in control. Right here, this Barbera vine, it's been out now. This is about two and a half weeks of growth. We did sustain a frost recently, so you're going to see some stuff like this. This is our highest elevation block, and cold air tends to sink, so these didn't get hit bad. But even here you can see some of the frost damage. The real problem with grapes and frost damage is after they send their first couple leaves out each season, well, the floral clusters, the unopened flower that becomes the grape, follows it. So if you get a bad frost and you lose this, you lose your crop. And we lost that in quite a few of our low-lying vineyards this year. This vine right here is a bilateral cordon, and it's in what we call a VSP system, a vertical shoot positioning system. I'll talk about that in a minute. That's what all these wires are all about. This vine was planted in year one, and it just grew like a little bush on the ground. Okay. And you also notice there's a bulge down here. Okay, that's the graft union. Okay, the majority of our vineyards, but not all of them, are on a rootstock called 1103P, which is a native North American rootstock that is not only drought tolerant, but it also is it has resistance to a lot of diseases, among them something called phylloxera, which is it's resistant to an insect that spreads a disease. Anyway, so this is a native rootstock from here down, and then Barbera grafted onto it above ground. Year one, it grows as a little shrub essentially, and then at the end of that year, we take whichever cane that grew out of that's the longest and the fattest. Year two, we keep a single one going up this little piece of metal, and we snip it off right at this wire here, which we call the cordon wire. The cordon are the two arms of this. We'll talk about in a minute. And then we get the vine to focus all its energy in that one central cane, which becomes the trunk. The next year, because there's buds all over this cane, just like this one here, we clean off all the buds down low, and we leave two, and those two grow out this way, and they become the two cordons. Okay, so in year three, you have your first cordon. And then in year four, and generally speaking, we haven't set any fruit yet. We're actually, if there is fruit, we're dropping it, okay? In year four, along this cordon, we'll allow each of the buds that are on that to start growing straight up, okay? And then we actually start developing what we call spurs. So if you look at each of these kind of positions here, these are where the buds were. Again, if you look at this, bud, there were buds along this, and we allowed those to grow up. and then we start forming these spurs, and the spurs become the permanent woody structure on the cordon that we set fruit on every year. All right, so each year we generally leave 2 buds on each spur. So for instance, this winter, so if this grows through this whole year and then this goes dormant, drops all the leaves, we'll come back and we will prune this off right here and leave 2 buds. Okay, and that's why you can see these getting taller and taller. So there's a year here, there's a year, there's last year, this was last year's pruning, and then now here's this year, and so on and so on. We do at times though, see how you see this little cane down here? I don't know if you guys can see that, but we'll sometimes leave a little cane down here so that down the road we can snip off the old wood and start down the bottom again. We call that a renewal, because your spurs will get so tall that your grapes are up here, and you don't really want that for a variety of reasons. But anyway, we have this all sitting, so there's our spurs we develop over time. When you leave a 2-bud spur, let's say my knuckle here and the tip are each of those buds, you're generally setting it up to have 2 clusters there. So this is one of the ways we control crop load. If we just let these grow wild, they would try to put grapes on every node everywhere, and you'd have hundreds of grapes per vine. And so the spur pruning keeps it down to 2 each. And then when we go back and do shoot thinning, which I can talk about too, we're making sure that the extra stuff that it shot out doesn't try to set more fruit, because obviously controlling your crop loads relate to wine quality. Okay, and in my opinion, and there's a lot of debate about this and a lot of rhetoric, this whole idea of 3 tons per acre or 2 tons per acre is how you make great wines. I don't really agree with that for a variety of reasons. For instance, you have different soils. Some are richer, some are less rich. Okay, if I have an incredibly rich soil and I put a grape on it and it's growing gangbusters and I try to limit that to 2 tons per acre, I'm going to just be fighting it all the time. Okay, what I might be better off doing is accepting the fact that it's a rich soil, and maybe I modify my trellis system so that it can handle it. And I'm saying, okay, maybe that's going to be a block where I make rosé out of, because I can handle more crop, So and what it really comes down to is balance, okay? In addition to the soil changes, there's different grapes out there. Grenache is 5 times as vigorous as Pinot Noir, for instance. And you're never going to try to farm Grenache the same as Pinot Noir. So part of it is getting to know your site and listening to the vines and seeing what they're doing and trying to adapt your habits and your winemaking to it. Furthermore, you have different winemaking goals. I'm not going to farm a block that I'm making, $15 rosé out of the same way I'm going to farm a block that I'm making $75, Syrah or Pinot out of. It just doesn't make sense. You can't make the economics work. So there's an economic reality. And usually I think what happens is you learn about your vineyards, you say, here's where I think the really high quality wines can come from. You farm those a certain way for that high quality and you adapt. And then there's other areas where like, well, down low here, this thing's always vigorous and the wines are never our absolute best wines. I'm going to work that into my programs that are a little less expensive and people can drink them day to day, things like that, Anyway, the other factor is that if you see where we're standing here, we're within the context of row spacing and vine spacing as well, and that's an important factor too. So generally speaking, your row spacing, the space between rows, relates to how you want to farm it. Okay, so I've got to be able to get a tractor down here, and we do mechanically farm this more or less as far as the big picture stuff: mowing, spraying organic fungicides, organic herbicides, things like that. You need to get a tractor down here, and you need to make your row big enough to handle your tractor without messing things up. And if you're on a slope, like the more sloped you get, the more your tractor leans, and you have to take that into account, because like our vineyard Colibri down south, I didn't plant it, we bought it, and it's sloped but not terraced. So when we drive our tractor, the wheel has to be like right here against the uphill side, because it leans so much that it'll catch stuff on the downhill side. It's actually kind of sketchy. You really have to know what you're doing. And maybe someday we'll terrace it, but we have such beautiful topsoil there, I don't want to lose it, because you have to cut into the slope to do that. But anyway, so the vine spacing is important. The row spacing is important, and certainly your tractors and such relate to that. The other thing that relates to is, how many vines do you want to get in an acre? Because the other reason why 2 or 3 tons per acre doesn't make sense is, well, if you have 500 vines in an acre versus 1,000 vines in an acre or 1,500 vines in an acre, does that really make sense? You know, saying 2 tons an acre makes great wine. I think for me it really comes more down to how many pounds are you setting on each vine, and then back to that whole balance conversation I was talking about. But so there's other factors, but those are the big ones. And then you have vine spacing, okay? So we basically have, if you look at this, you know, we have 6 foot spacing between our vines. So this is actually 7 feet here, and then we have 6 foot here. Now, the spacing between your vines, there's different theories. On one hand, you could say, okay, we're going to space these 6 feet because we believe that the vigor of these vines is such that this bilateral cordon we want to do is they're going to be have just the right amount of vigor to have this size, okay? And given a normal situation, our goal each year is to have a healthy vine, and we want the canopy to grow up to about here, okay? If it's growing well beyond that, you have all this extra management to do all the time to control that. You can't have it flopping over and shading your fruit, which we can talk about. We don't want it getting snagged on a tractor, and we don't want to have to spend a lot of money hedging it and controlling it constantly. On the flip side of the coin, you don't want to have your canopy so small that it doesn't have enough photosynthetic surface to ripen your fruit, okay? So really, vine spacing is not wanting to over-compete and not be able to have that balance in the canopy. On the other hand, when you have very, very vigorous varieties, some people actually plant closer together so the vines compete with each other enough that they don't overgrow on the top. So it's, you know, it's complex, and again, it gets back to things like soil, and you know, what's your water supply like, and all the other factors that you're dealing with. So really the goal is to have that perfectly balanced vine where you have to do the minimal amount of work to get your canopy up to here and have a good proportion between your leaves and the fruit you're trying to ripen each year, okay? And again, there's a million different permutations of that. If you have a very rich valley bottom soil versus a lean kind of limestone soil like we have over at one of our other sites over there, you may not be able to get enough vigor putting them too close together, and you might have less vines per acre so that they have more sun on them, more root space to spread out. You might even add more drippers. You know, we have the luxury of dripping. You know, you go to France, if you drip irrigate, you're going to not be able to use the appellation, the AOC that you're in, for instance. There's a whole other world of argument about that and whether we're stepping outside the terroir by watering. But anyway, back to the vines themselves. Right now, we're going through a process called shoot thinning. So we've done our pruning. We have our 2 bud spurs at the kind of intervals we like, which is usually about the width of a hand. All right, and the reason we like that for Barbaria at the width of the hand is when these clusters, if you look at this right now, okay, and this one's a little high, when these clusters pollinate and size up, they're going to dangle down, okay, and they're all going to be hanging along here. And if we put those spurs too close together, the clusters are going to kind of build up on one another, okay? We want each cluster, you want to be able to easily fit your hand between it, because when they're all hanging here, you want, number one, you want to be, with reds especially, you want enough sun to be able to hit them. And then you also want airflow between them, because after a rain, let's say monsoons later in the season, you want them to dry out quickly, okay? And the more tightly clustered they are, in fact we call them cluster fucks when they're really stuck together, we have to actually come through and drop fruit too. So hopefully if you did your pruning well and some of these other steps well, you don't have to deal with that. But you want a nice zone. When these all hang down, the fruit should be just hanging right along this cordon, okay? And the beauty of that is we can see it, and it sets its quality. It allows us to pick it easy later in the season. We're going to come through later and pull leaves as well, so we can expose that fruit so it gets the right amount of sun and better airflow. But it's all about creating the ideal little ripening environment for each of those clusters, which is the right amount of sun, not too much, but not too much shade. Back to, like, you don't want your canopy always growing over, because you get too much shade, you get vegetal fruit. There's a chemical in most red grapes called pyrazine. That's a shortened, it's like methyl blah 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 something, but everybody in the industry calls it pyrazine. And if your red grapes get way too much shade, pyrazine stays in the grape. If they get sun, pyrazine actually breaks down. And if you look back, like for instance, Monterey back in the 80s, Monterey got beat up a lot for their cabs being way too vegetal, the Merlots being way too vegetal. Well, that's because they were growing these huge canopies over there, and these grapes were never seeing the sun, and the pyrazine wasn't breaking down. Well, when they started doing this, lifting their canopy and exposing their fruit, well, guess what? Monterey cabs started to have more fruit characters and less green. And then they maybe went too far, and they became so fruity they were like, oh, it doesn't taste like Bordeaux anymore, so let's balance that, you know. Which is also why, if you guys look up here, you can see that we have notches on these. We can actually louver. Let's say we have an incredibly hot summer. That's west, this is east. You can see the sun behind us. But we can actually move wires around, drop them, and we can actually treat our canopy like an umbrella. Usually it's hotter later in the day, and let's say we're having excessive heat and we're worried about the grapes getting too much sun and too much heat, we can just take a wire out and let that canopy kind of flop over here. So these systems are very versatile, which is very useful. Okay, so what we're about to start doing is shoot thinning. So when we leave a spur each year with 2 buds on it, okay, the vine ideally grows 2 canes, 1 out of each bud, but every bud on a grape has actually 3 buds in it. There's a primary bud in the middle and then 2 little axillary buds. For instance, if they get frosted and that big one was out, it can still shoot out the little ones, okay? Little ones generally don't have great fruit, and they will have much smaller flower clusters, but at least the vine, when you think about its own evolution, it still is going to put out growth, and it's going to grow that year. It's not going to just lose it, okay? But our shoot thinning is trying to get back to just having those 2 canes. So for instance, here's the spur that was left last year, and then here's the 2 main buds that our pruners left on it. Here's one nice big beautiful cane that actually has 2 clusters on it. See these 2 right here? These are two flowers that will become grape clusters. And then here's another one. I'm just going to pull a couple leaves off here so you guys can see this. And here's another really nice one. You can see this has a couple clusters on it too. Well, I'm going to go ahead and snap off this bottom one because that would be too much fruit for this, okay? When I go to this next one here, I'm going to look at it, okay? And you can see I'm going to go ahead and pull off a bunch of these until I'm back at my 2 again. I'm also going to leave this teeny little one because as spurs get longer and longer and longer, I don't want my fruit zone to be some fruit here and some fruit up here, some buried in the canopy, rotting and not getting sun. I want it all down here. So I'm going to leave this little thing. It doesn't have any flowers on it, but if this grows well, it'll allow me during my pruning season to chop that off and make sure that my wood, my spur, is staying low. Does that make sense? Okay. So shoot thinning is kind of what it really is backing up and reinforcing what we were trying to do with our 2 bud spur pruning. Now see this right here? I have 3 up here now, okay? And I'm going to look at them all and go, okay, this one has some flowers on it. This one has some little flowers. This one, it's not going to afford me a renewal like this down here where I might be able to chop it off. So I'm just going to kind of pick the best ones. This one's actually over here kind of abutting these, so I'm going to get rid of that, and there's my 2, okay? So, and you can also see that as I'm doing this, if you look at this right here, see how this is now nice and open? Where these grapes end up hanging down here, they're going to have a lot of space. There's going to be a lot of airflow. You know, and I could just keep going along here and looking at this and saying, okay, there's my 2 there, and this one I'm going to leave this little bottom one to try to replace it. Kind of come through, leave a little one on this side. See up here, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Come along here. So I've got something down below, but it's really kind of pinner. So I'm going to get rid of that. So this one got frosted, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. You can see that little cluster, that's not going to, these little, flowers aren't going to probably produce grapes. So I'm just going to look at this and leave those 2 over here. Okay, I've got 1, 2, 3. There's my 2. I'll just finish this up to here. Got 1, 2 there. This one will give me that renewal I was talking about. The other thing is I look at the size of these spurs sometimes. See how this spur is bigger than a pencil, like a pencil, and that one's way bigger than a pencil, but this one's really tiny. I'm actually only going to leave 1 on that. So anyway, you can see the difference now in how this looks. And a well-managed vineyard where you're trying to go for high quality, and this Barbera is one of our best grapes, will Now we've left only a certain amount of fruit, we have a certain amount of air in there, and then actually when we come through next pruning season, we've also got a much easier pruning job because we've cleaned out all the kind of the bullshit out of the canopy. So, and then the next phase after this, once these grow up and these green stalks that you saw me snap off so easily start to lignify, they get woody, we're going to come, and anything that's not already inside these wires, we're going to come and tuck inside these wires. But the problem is if we do that right now, they snap off easily, so I don't want to take the chance of breaking them. They will also start attaching. Sometimes we don't have to do anything because they'll attach with their tendrils. After that, the next big phase is leaf pulling. I can't really show you right now, but once these all start forming, they get pollinated and form berries, and the grapes are down here, we like the zone that the grapes are in on the less hot side, okay, to not have leaves in front of them. Okay, so because these rows are running more or less north-south, okay, and we can talk about row orientation as well. Generally speaking, the morning side, the east, is going to be cooler than the afternoon side, okay, and then certainly it's hottest in the middle of the day, but the way we manage our canopy, we've got lots of grapes, lots of leaves up here to protect it. So we're going to come through in another month and a half, and we're going to just take off all the leaves roughly between this cordon and this first set of wires, and that completely exposes the fruit on the morning side. Now if we were running east-west, okay, we would pull the leaves on the north side, okay, and again, if you pull them on the really hot sunny side, you run the risk of them being sunburned, and they'll actually, on the surface of the grape, they'll get these scars, and sometimes those scars will even burst and you'll lose that berry. The berry becomes a point of infection, etc., etc. So row orientation can be important from that perspective. Other things like just the terrain, okay, you can see here we're more or less perpendicular to the slope in most areas. So if you've got a slope like this, we're not going to plant along the slope unless we terrace, because again, the tractor will tip really severely. So it's actually, believe it or not, better to run your rows straight up and down slopes, even though they're steep, because a tractor is really stable going downhill as long as it's not tipping. So usually what you'll do is you'll go down and you'll have a flat area to turn around and then go back up. It's going down a crazy slope like this that gets sketchy. So that's an important thing to us. In fact, in general, if you look at our vineyards, they're going down the slope. We've also, in this vineyard in particular, we've left all the drainages open. And in fact, you guys went through a first gate, then you went through two more right away. We actually fenced that whole drainage on both sides because of wildlife migration, because the water's right down here, and we're like, gosh, if we build this massive fence line and keep all the deer, the javelina, everything from getting down to the water, number one, we're not being responsible ecologically, and number two, we're also putting a lot of pressure on our vineyard for these things to want to get under the fence, and then they're in the vineyard, look at all these grapes. So we try to create these corridors down through our vineyard to try to work with, the natural environment here and the wildlife so that they could still access the resources they need, which obviously water is a big one. And then orientation could also play into winds. These rows buffet one another. So if our prevailing winds are coming from one direction, the edge of your vineyard can act as a protection for the inner vineyard. In fact, our normal winds do tend to come out of the west here, and sometimes the west edge of our vineyard we have more shatter. I don't know if you guys know what shatter is. So in shatter, it's just you end up with messed up grapes and they don't fully pollinate. So, yeah.
Eric,
Pleasure having you guys.
that was incredible.